Long before I went on any big adventure, I loved reading stories of travel and expeditions and exploration, and I dreamed of one day being a writer myself. And reading books encouraged me to get on my bike and set off to cycle around the world. And during the 4 years I was on the road, I had a lot of time to daydream about the book that I might write. And I really thought, well, my big vanity daydream was that maybe I could write a book that one day might even pay for this entire journey around the world, a journey that cost me £7,000. So I wasn't exactly J.K. Rowling-esque with my ambitions. I came home, wrote my book about cycling around the world. Every publisher under the sun rejected it. Complete failure, disaster. I was very despondent. But then a good friend of mine, thank you, Paul, encouraged me not to give up and to just self-publish my book, to do it anyway. So I decided to split the story of cycling around the world in half to kind of keep some of my powder dry and self-publish my very own book, which a friend of mine did the cover for. Thank you, Jim. I self-published Moods of Future Joys. And I'm trying to see when I did this. Does it say? Golly gosh. The end of 2006, I self-published that, and I sold a few, mostly to people whose names were Humphreys, but on the back of that, a small publisher came along, and they liked it, and they turned it into a proper book, and they actually published it. So this is my first ever properly published book, which has morphed over time into this edition now. And following on from that, so this is the story of me cycling down Africa, and it's well, as you would expect, it's a young man's first adventure, and it's a bit rough and raw perhaps, but it's filled with the thrill and the terror of changing life direction, leaving the track that all of your friends are on, that everyone's expecting you to be on, which for me was going off to get a proper grown-up job as a teacher, and instead just saying, to heck with it. I haven't got much money, I've never done anything like this before, but I'm going to go try and cycle around the world. And on the back of it, I wrote these two books, which I'm very fond of for being my first books, and definitely the books of my biggest ever adventure. The next book I wrote was my first foray into trying to think about how the experiences of travel and adventure and solitude and loneliness and the struggle and the doubt that comes with being on a 46,000 mile journey, the lessons from that, how they could maybe apply to my normal real life back home in the real world. During this time, I was not making very much money at all, so to pay for my life whilst I tried to get into being a writer, I used to give talks at schools. Cycling around the world, I did about 300 talks for a kids charity that I was supporting, Hope and Homes for Children. So I was getting quite good at doing talks to kids. But when I came home, I needed to start getting paid for these talks. So I started going to schools and doing talks about cycling around the world. And I noticed that kids loved the idea of cycling around the world as much as adults did. Maybe more so, actually, because they do so with the optimism and enthusiasm and joyful naivety that what you need to go on big adventures. So on the back of that, I wrote this trilogy of The Boy Who Biked the World. It's essentially my story of cycling around the world, but done for children, aged about sort of 8 to 11-ish. This is my best-selling book of all time now, which is great. I'm really pleased that it's hopefully encouraging young people to just think a bit more boldly and wildly and be a bit more curious than perhaps they are programmed to do these days. The next trip I went on that I wrote about, I walked across southern India, and it was a very solitary journey. Followed a holy river, the Kaveri River, and I could have had this book published by my publisher, but by then I was quite curious about going back to self-publishing, to have the complete freedom to do what I wanted. So this book was I think I was going through a phase. So I wrote this book myself, I edited it myself, nobody ever looked at it until the day it was published. No proofreaders, no editors, nothing, no feedback, nothing, just me. when I look in it now, I can definitely see that it would certainly have benefited from an editor. It was my attempt to sort of explain why I travel and to figure out my head. I'm really proud of this book. I think this might be the book that I'm most proud of writing. The good thing about self-publishing it was you could do quirky things. So as well as doing that, I also turned the whole book into this massive fold-out magazine, which my friends have been teasing me about for years because I think this is genius, and I made literally thousands of them and no one ever buys them. So when people buy them on books on my website, I'm giving these away by the bucket load. I've nearly given them all away. Soon these will be rare things. I turned the same book into a book of photography as well, photography and excerpts from it. So self-publishing is wonderful. I'm a huge evangelist for the freedom it gives you, and it's every single book I ever do, I'm always thinking, should I self-publish this? Is this one to do? Even though now I've got a nice, decent, big publisher, it's a great thing to do. The year after that was my first foray into making a decent length film, a 1,000-mile desert journey in the footsteps of the hero. Walking across the empty quarter desert was such a cool trip, but I loved the whole process of trying to make a film. It takes a heck of a lot longer to make a film than it does to walk across a desert. And then a couple more years later, I'd moved from big adventures to small adventures, to the idea of micro adventures. And I think this is an interesting thing. So I was trying to become a travel writer who got known for writing big books about big, tough trips. And then I wrote this book, which is the complete antithesis of that. This is about short, local, cheap stuff you can do anywhere. Basically, it's about going to sleep on local hills in suburbia. I was a bit nervous when I started doing this because I personally felt it was a good idea, but I worried that other people would not think that, and I worried what people would think about me for forsaking big adventures for small little ones. This book has done brilliantly. It's proved really popular. I never look back in my old books because I just get annoyed that they're not as good as they should be, and I want to see mistakes. So I never ever look at my old books, and I never take any pleasure from them either. However, last week I was doing some research for some plans I've got next year, micro-adventure plans. So I thought, oh, I'll look back through this. I looked through it, and I have to say, this book is absolutely brilliant. I'm so impressed at myself, my diligence. There's so much content and material in here. This is a extremely well thought through, thoroughly researched, thorough book. It's very, very good. So by then I was getting quite interested in this idea of trying to help people and encourage people to do stuff. But still in my heart, I love the huge, big, whopping adventures. And that then led on to Grand Adventures, which is a book that is encouraging people to go off and have their own first big adventure and trying to bust down the barriers, you know, the lack of time, the lack of money, the lack of knowledge, the lack of expertise, through the experiences I've learned on my own big trips and through interviews with loads and loads of cool people who've done really great stuff. This book hasn't sold very well, but I'm proud of it. I think if you're planning your first big journey, I think this is a useful book. And then finally, La Décima, number 10, this year's book, Great Adventures. Great Adventurers, the incredible expeditions of 20 explorers. I've noticed I've got a bit of a naming issue with my books. I'm not very original in them, but this is Great Adventurers, and it tells the story of the men and women who inspired me on my own journeys. So in a way, actually, it brings me full circle. I was inspired originally by travellers and travel writing, and here now I share the travel writing and the adventurers who got me going in the very first place. 10 books down, many more to go. The end.